Okay, hi everybody. I guess we should get started. We don't want to waste any time that we have with our guest today. I just want to thank all of our attendees for being here. Thanks so much for joining and for taking the time to spend with us today for what I know is going to be a very interesting discussion. When we last checked our registrations, we have attendees from all over the world. We have attendees from Canada, US, UK, Italy, Mexico, Germany, and Israel. So welcome to everybody. My name is Bree Aukeson. I am an associate professor at the Faculty of Social Work here at Laurier, and I'm also the Canada Research Chair in Global Adversity and Wellbeing. The format of today's discussion is we are going to have some questions that Dr. No and I are going to be asking Jaivet about his new book, but we're also going to be monitoring the Q&A. So if you have questions, please type them into the Q&A. Feel free to ask anything that you're interested in. We'll try to integrate those questions as many as we can within our time frame. Ann and I were discussing a few days ago how we could probably have this discussion for probably several hours, maybe, or even a whole day. So we're going to try to fit as much as we can into today. Before I introduce our panelists, I just want to mention the sponsors. CRISP is the Center for Research on Security Practices. We are committed to enhancing scholarly research as well as influencing policy, practice, and social change on a range of issues such as homelessness, war, migration, income disparity, and other forms of marginalization. We work with researchers across multiple disciplines and institutions, as well as government, industry, and community stakeholders. And I just want to acknowledge Dr. Carrie Sanders, our director. Thank you, Carrie, for your enthusiasm for bringing Jaivet and his story to this event. And also Dr. Samantha Henderson, who is behind the scenes. She's actually in that box where it has the book, where you can see the book on your screen, and she's doing all of our tech support today. So really, thank you so much, Samantha, as well. And then the Global Adversity and Wellbeing Research Group is the other sponsor today. And that research group examines the intersections of extreme adversity, such as poverty, war, and climate change, and psychosocial well-being through research using participatory methods, sharing research results with academics, practitioners, policymakers, and lay audiences, and also training a new cohort of student researchers. So I'd like to introduce our panelists. The first is Dr. Ann No. She is an assistant professor at the Faculty of Social Work at Wilfrid Laurier University. Her areas of research are critical refugee and migration studies, critical multiculturalism in settler societies such as Canada, and community action and engaged scholarship. Her research approach and interests are informed by her positionality as a racialized migrant settler and her social work practice with individuals and communities. And she's a wonderful scholar and a wonderful friend as well. So thank you so much, Ann, for being here today. I'm not going to do a really fulsome introduction of Jaivet because we're going to really talk about his life a lot today. But just a really short intro. Jaivet Ealom is a Toronto-based author. He's a former refugee, a refugee advocate, and he's the only person known to have escaped from Manus Island Detention Center in Papua New Guinea, which is the focus of the book and our focus of our discussion today. Before we get into our questions, I just wanted to give a few impressions of the book, my initial impressions. If you haven't read this book, please do. Hopefully today will be an impetus for you to check out Jaivet's book. I met Jaivet before I read the book. I knew he was an amazing person, and we met last year at another panel discussion. And so reading his story was quite powerful. The book itself kept me awake at night because I wanted to read it. So I was staying up really late, like past midnight, reading his story. It was riveting, and it's extremely well written, and it just moves in this really fast pace like a novel. But when I actually did go to sleep, it gave me nightmares as well. Like I actually had nightmares about what Jaivet had gone through. And again, Jaivet has lived through this nightmare. Every page was dog-eared when I had the copy, much to the chagrin of my colleague An, who actually I found out hates dog-eared books, but every page was dog-eared almost. I even did like double dog ears on pages because there were so many interesting things that came up that kind of formed the basis of the questions that we have today. And again, I had to remind myself that it's not a novel, it's not fiction, it was actually someone's life. So the stories of individuals who are affected by this kind of adversity are oftentimes subsumed into statistics. We hear numbers, we hear, 45 people were on a boat and that capsized, or we hear that, this many millions of people are now displaced or now refugees. And this is really described by scholars Paul and Scott Slovic as human beings with the tears dried off. Right? So we're hearing statistics and we're not actually hearing about the human beings behind those statistics. Yet the voices of those who are most affected by these adversities really adds this critical layer of understanding the human impact of these, terrible things that happen in the world. Telling stories with all of their nuance and complexity can really help ensure that the voices of those impacted are heard and marshaled for change. So these books like this are really important for making those kinds of changes. Before we get into our discussion, I just want to give a brief background on the Rohingya population. Jaivet's going to talk more about that, but I just wanted to give a brief overview and then also a brief overview of Jaivet's story, just in case you haven't read the book, and then we're able to move right into our discussion. So the Rohingya minority group, which is a group that Jaivet belongs to, was born into, is considered one of the most persecuted minorities in the world. Despite living in Burma, what is more currently referred to as Myanmar, for generations, the government there has never recognized Rohingya as citizens. They've denied them the right to vote and imposed strict restrictions on their movement, their access to basic services such as education and healthcare. In August of 2017, they experienced what the UN and other organizations described as a textbook example of ethnic cleansing, and what was later termed as genocide, consisting of horrific acts of violence, the burning of homes and villages, sexual violence at the hands of the military and the local Buddhist population there. By a year after that, there were almost 1 million Rohingya who had fled their homes or the remains of their homes. Many of them fled to Bangladesh. In terms of Jaivet's story, again, he's going to talk more about his story, but I just wanted to give you a bit of a timeline for us to work on as we're moving into the discussion, the question and answer section. In 2013, and Jaivet, I wasn't sure if you were about 21 at the time. Was it 21 years old at the time? Yeah, we were in 21. He fled Burma due to a well-founded fear of persecution, the textbook definition of refugee, at the hands of the Myanmar government and supporters of the ethnic cleansing of Rohingya. He was able to get to Indonesia, where he then attempted to get to Australia by boat. He almost drowned. He washed up on the shores of the Indonesian archipelago. And he made another courageous attempt to get to Australia again. And after another harrowing journey at sea, landed on Christmas Island, where he was detained by Australian authorities for 6 months. The Australian authorities then sent him to Manus Island, which is a notorious and controversial prison that has been described as a hell on earth. And certainly from reading the book, it comes across that way. He lived there for almost 4 years. There was inedible food. He was in solitary confinement. There was psychological, physical abuse, substandard water, sanitation facilities, abhorrent sleeping conditions. There was a hunger strike, serious injuries and illnesses, a suicide attempt, many suicide attempts among the detainees there, and little connection with the outside world. Using tricks that he learned from watching Prison Break, he posed as an interpreter, and he was able to take a flight from Manus Island to Port Moresby. From there, he was able to get to Solomon Islands, Fiji, Hong Kong, and eventually Canada. When he arrived in Canada on Christmas Eve, in the dead of winter, he lived in a homeless shelter. And today, after all that, he's a student at U of T and an advocate for refugees and for Rohingya more specifically. We're so pleased to have you here today, Jaivet, and thank you so much for being here.
Thank you. Thank you for having me. Thank you for organizing this for the team at the Laurier University and those working behind the scenes. You might not know here, but amazing, amazing organizing and amazing.
Thank you. So we're going to just dive into some questions. I hope I gave enough background, so hopefully people can follow along. We're going to go in chronological order, hopefully, so we can, move through your story a bit. So for the audience members who aren't as familiar with the context, can you talk a little bit more? And I talked briefly about it, about the overview of the status and treatment of the Rohingya in Myanmar. Maybe give us a bit of a background of that. And also, Jaivet's going to read a little bit of some excerpts from his book to illustrate, some of his story as well. So feel free, Jaivet.
Yeah, thank you. Maybe actually, with that being said, maybe I'll read a paragraph from the treatments of Rohingya from the book, then I'll add up to it. And I think I'll do this often in subsequent questions if I can think of anything relevant. I tend to think the writing is much more clear than the way I speak. English is my fourth language, but when you're writing, I have the time like to go back and make it clearer. So I often think I write clearer than I talk, which I often rumble through a lot of stuff. So I'll do just that. I will read a paragraph or an excerpt like whenever I think is relevant, then I will build onto it. And in the meantime, I'll be happy to take any questions that you have specific to the discussions, and we can elaborate on that too. This paragraph is from my times in Burma when I just finished high school. And during all my life in Burma until that point, the area that I was allowed, or the entire populations of Rohingya were allowed from our town, where a universe that you could trespass within an hour, just 3-kilometer radius. To go anywhere outside of that area, any Rohingya needed written permission from the military that you have to go to paperwork and apply prior to days. So this was from my first trip out of that, which I often refer to as a hoof print, it's a muddy hoof print that was constantly shrinking at the same time. And I can go on why I mentioned shrinking, but this was the first time that I was out of that footprint, and it was a reflection on what life was like for other Rohingya who were in their own footprint across the countryside. Compared to being buried alive or beaten with rifle butts, it was a light punishment. Yet the message was clear. They decided where we could go and where we lived or died. At the time, I saw the arrogance and the abuse without understanding why or how things had ended up that way. In the years to come, I learned more about the origins and organization of the Burmese military, whose rallying cry was one blood, one voice, one command. By that point, I knew enough of world history to consider the similarity of the slogan with the blood and soil chanted by the Nazis during the rise of Hitler. Nativism and religious humiliation were the twin foundations of the power in Burma. Before they were sent into countryside to stop the Rohingyas, soldiers underwent a program of brainwashing. They were drilled to believe that purity of race was the key to Burmese prosperity and sovereignty, and that they were the brave and pious instruments of the holy nationalistic vision. When we returned to Mondo a month later, Junaid and I were almost thankful we lived behind a ring of checkpoints. At least we could wake up each day with some assurance that physical torture or death were not around the corner. I didn't laugh or smile for the first few weeks back. knowing what people were enduring in the countryside. Just a few years later, most of the villages Junaid and I had visited on that trip were burned to the ground. The inhabitants who fled the fire were shot in the back as they tried to escape. However, by that point, when the wave of the genocide was starting to reach its diabolical peak, I had managed to escape the hoofprint in Mangdo, only to find myself in an even smaller jail, one with high walls and barbed wire, on a remote island, half a world away. The treatment of the Rohingyas. I often struggles to find words how to describe it, because it was a treatment that a torture that you only come to know by the absence of it, because it was ever present there on your neck. Every single movement of yours, from having a guest over to admitting to hospitals to crossing the 3-kilometer radius universe. Every movement was fine-tuned, calculated, and structured in a way to make the most out of the misery. And when this is something that I came to realize much even after the book, like when I was going through the book, I was doing also my other my research, like across other parallel patterns in different part of the world. And something that crossed my mind was when you put a specific group, a specific people in a tiny confined place and torture it every day, where you only come to realize of the torture when it wasn't there. Otherwise, it became normalized and institutionalized in a way you come to see the world as if it was something normal. And the thing that crossed across my mind was how I believe people who were never subjected to prosecutions, or people who have never to go through detention, would think the effect of confinement is something's only affect the body. But I can reassure you that the same physical confinement also affect on your mind and on your brain. The way you think becomes smaller. You can't see far, and you have the same mental the prison on your mental, the cage on the mental, and the way you think as well. I wouldn't even say thinking, because thinking implies you are thinking logically something toward or increasing and improving, but it was more of a thinking in cycles and getting nowhere. So it was not just physical, not just psychological, but also on developments of, I think, the whole ethnic groups, like intellectual development as well. So it was restricted in every way you could imagine. And of course, this became a much, much worse case scenario after the genocide. And I often remind people, like, genocide was not an overnight development. It was decades of building up. The genocide was decades of building up the treatment that I just described. The pressure, build it up. And people's outsides only come to know when it is bad enough to make to the news, when it is bad enough to catch the attention of breaking news. But there are a lot of other precursors that you can clearly look into genocide, including the treatments of confinement as one of the examples. But that remained the same until today, even today, for those who remain inside the Burma. Not that the life is much better for those who fled. Over 1 million people fled across the border during the height of the genocide. But not that life is much better outside in the refugee camps across several camps in Bangladesh and Cox's Bazar. For those inside, the life remains the same, if not worse, to what I just described. That's the reality of the Rohingya at this very moment as we speak.
Yeah, I think, and it's so interesting to hear how it's, in a way, you traded one prison within Burma for another prison, and you didn't trade yourself, you didn't choose it, but you found yourself in one prison, born into that prison, and then you found yourself in another prison when you were in Manus Island too. So it's really interesting to me. I want to touch upon one element of that you talk about with how Rohingya are treated. And you talk a lot about education, and education seems to be kind of a shining star for you, but also for many who are fleeing oppressive regimes and violence. Education, as you wrote in your book, was it was blocked through the government tactic of placing schools in Buddhist neighborhoods and staffing them with just Buddhist teachers. And so schools were a staging ground for abuse, and Rohingya children didn't like to go to school because of that fact. And then you also mentioned it was a crime, or still is a crime, to carry a book in your native language. And these tactics really blocked the intellectual progress of the Rohingya population and ensured that this rich heritage is not passed down to the next generation. And you call it an act of cultural genocide. So education was really not attainable for most Rohingya due to these government policies. You also talk about attending university. So most of the tier 1 universities were they would not accept Rohingya applicants because you were stripped of your citizenship rights. So these tier 1 universities were the only places to study things like law or medicine or engineering or economics. And then you talk about your mom, and you talk about your mother, who was remarkably well educated, and your dad as well, who was very supportive and found value in higher education. And you learned that being well educated was a way to counter racism and oppression. Can you talk a little bit more about what you did to enroll at university and what education has meant to you throughout your journey?
Education might have meant different things to me, but to my mom, education is more of it's not education for its own value per se or even knowledge. For her, it was simply a survival tool. And in Burmese, the word literate literally translates into being able to read and write in Burmese, which is the language of the junta and the language of the armed force that controls the 70–80% of the territory today. So from my mom's perspective, I think she is one of the very few women at her time to be able to read and write and argue back with the security forces in Burmese in the entire family. And to her, if you were to survive this, you need to know the rules, the game better than them who are playing it with you. So for her, education is not merely something that you should work hard or you should study, but it's more of if you don't get this right, if you don't become extraordinary at this, like you won't survive this. To her, regarding access to educations and blocking of access to educations to tier 1 level university in Burma, which consists of from aeronautics to medicine and law. To me at the time, it just didn't make sense. It was like such a waste of human capital. Like if these people could be educated, they will become better contributor to the society, to the whole region, and why just actively block them access. But now it makes so much sense. This seems to be disfranchisement of a population 101. Just classic textbook examples of like at first block the education, all the intellectual progress, and then and gradually you will have a population who cannot think for themselves on their own. So it didn't make sense at the moment, but if looking back right now, it was textbook examples of disenfranchisement of a population. For me, I was also subjected to the same treatment as all the other Rohingyas, but my mom ingenuity came into play. The way Rohingya, a little bit of background, like why I was able to do this was Rohingya at the beginning, at my grandparent generations, were not subjected to the same treatment as I was subjected. At that time, they were full citizen. They could compete for public offices, and there were several, and all, just anything and everything a full citizen could do, and they could travel anywhere. And in my generation, it was in my parents' generation, it was eroded to you could only travel as long as it is inside the province that you were born. And then later in life, it became you can travel as long as it is within the town of you were born. And then like in my generations, it became you could travel only as long as it is from this village that you were born with, or this 3-kilometer radius, which was the case of, which was my case. So it was a gradual erosion. From my mom, she enjoyed full citizenship at some point in her earlier life, but was stripped away after the law was passed. But she holds on to old documents and never surrendered them. So I was able to use them and then not pretend, but at the same time, not 100% fully upfront to use those documents and get into university, knowing for a fact that I will not, the university will not confer a degree, and then the university will, I won't be able to go to the graduations. For my mom, it was just get educated, learn how to deal with this. That's enough. So it was completely different goal than going to university here. That's how I got into university and went through this. But that wasn't the case for majority of people. Me and my cousins were the only 2 persons of our entire class, I believe, that to make it through. But just because our parents were more resourceful, and in my mom's case, it was just out of because of her ingenuity.
Yeah, it was quite ingenious for her to come up with that idea of using her citizenship, your parents' citizenship papers in order to enroll. And I found that to be really interesting. And also to enroll, knowing that you're not going to be able to graduate due to the policies was quite remarkable too. Did you have a follow-up question?
Yeah, absolutely. And Jaivet, thank you so much for being here and really for writing your story. I think I think this book is not just your story. I think within this book, through the telling of your story, and I didn't dog ear mine. I used respectful tabs, but through the telling of the story, I feel like it's a scathing critique, really, of the refugee enterprise, the refugee making, refugee industrial enterprise, and I really appreciated that. And to hear you talk about your mom now in this space, but then also to read your words about your mother, I feel like your mother and your family were with you throughout the whole book. But just to follow up on what Bree was asking about exceptionalism, right? So in the similar passages on education, you wrote, as a Rohingya, we did not have the luxury of being merely ordinary. We had to be well educated to counter the racism and oppression the government was using to stunt our lives. And as you're saying, right, education as a survival tool. I'm wondering if you can connect that to a bigger conversation about refugees' exceptionalism. So, within the refugee industrial complex, refugee people are often celebrated for there's an expectation for them to have to exceed all imaginable and unimaginable hurdles as you have, and to achieve this exceptionality. So do you feel that pressure to have to be exceptional now as a person here now in Toronto, in Canada, back at school? And at the same time, how do you think it drives the refugee advocacy work that you do?
Sometimes it's not just pressure, it's more of a reality that if you were to make it, if you were to survive, for example, when I arrived, I didn't know a single soul. So I barely knew anything about Canada like 48 hours before. So if you were to make it, you have to work probably more than double, if not double amount like that any ordinary people would do. So sometimes it's not just pressure, it determines whether you're able to survive and make it or not. And I have, and for those who go through detentions just the very moment before they're refugees, which is the case in Australia for 95% of the refugee population, they go through like some sort of detention. And I have huge respect for those people like who were able to stand on their own feet after going through detention. This process with mess with your mind, with mess with your brains, and you come out of it alive and mentally insane, and being able to make it in the real world I have like huge respect. On the other end, this is quite interesting to me as well, that oftentimes I hear a lot of news, refugees, some fear, but some, I think, more of a dislike toward like refugees. This is not particularly the case in Canada, but I've seen it in other countries. The resentment toward refugees taking a job, or like kind of like getting on the welfare to freeload. But in my experience, what I have experienced is like just I became refugee overnight without actually knowing that, never imagining for myself that I would become a refugee. And then I went through 2 full-fledged prisons and on the run for 6 months. That what I have figured out and came across many people where it is not oftentimes the richest or the smartest people that made it out of the country that they were actively being persecuted. It is oftentimes the most resourceful people who were able to make out of it alive. For me, that was the level 1. If you were to think it as a Darwinian evolution, that was level 1, filtering out the most resourceful. And then surviving any refugee camps and surviving any detention for years. In Australia's case, it was indefinite. I didn't have a detention sentence. Surviving that and coming out mentally sane, it basically filtered out like a good chunk of people didn't make it well enough mentally sane. That filter out the second levels of peoples at that point. And when people do come out and integrate into the real community and the real world and community, and work twice the amount of a normal person and then make it, that's the third levels of like evolutions doing the trick there. So people who does come out like usually are very resourceful, and I find it like hard to believe people would think they come here to take on rather than to contribute. And a lot of the people that are eager to make up time for the time being wasted, or the time we wasted detention, and for the time where resources were just simply wasted by blocking access by different regime across the world. So to me, it just doesn't add up when people think of this that narrative of here to take the job or to freeload rather than to contribute. By people who were probably the most resourceful I've came to know, and who have the most to contribute to, honestly.
Yeah. Yeah. And I think that's a persistent theme in your book, where the power of these dominant ideas that are fabricated, right, to push like political agendas and the impact that has on individual lives. I think that comes up very clearly too. Yeah, I think I'll turn it back to Bree.
I'm just quickly gonna get my charger. I think my laptop is dying. Just 1 second.
No problem. We'll take a quick break if anybody needs to run to the bathroom for a second. That's always stressful when you're like in something and you see your battery going down. Can I reach my charger from here?
Bree, these are the tabs.
I know. After I talked to you, I actually undog-eared all of my pages because I felt guilty. So they're not dog-eared anymore.
Oh no, I'm teasing.
They're temporary dog ears until I can type it down. So
I do confess I highlight. So I know that's something
okay.
that I'm very strongly against.
I don't mind. I think books are for engaging and writing and connecting. I love marginalia where you can kind of write notes in the margins. So yeah, I'm for that. No problem. Jaivet, you're good with your tech now? Okay, good. I wanted to move maybe a little bit from talking about Burma, Myanmar, and moving a bit more to your experience in Australia and on Manus Island in Papua New Guinea. And the thing that really struck me throughout the book was, and this is something we've talked about before, Jaivet, about bureaucracy used as a tool of oppression. This was just, it came out, it was so clear throughout your time, both growing up in Burma and dealing with the bureaucracy that the government there has imposed to oppress the Rohingya. I have one example is how they have this law called the Vacant Fallow and Virgin Land Management Law that states that any building destroyed by fire defaults to becoming government property. So this really weird law that exists there. And the British created this law because it has roots in the colonial era, and it was intended to, its intended legislation was really different than what happened with it. So it really incentivized arson. So what we're seeing in Myanmar and Burma, we're seeing a lot of arson against Rohingya property. You'll see, Buddhist majority community members will set fire to Rohingya homes. And this is something that we talked about when we talk about domicide. And so these places are routinely torched, and Human Rights Watch and other places has, photos, aerial footage showing just villages completely burned to the ground. And those places, those homes become the property of the junta, and they offer subsidies and other lures for Buddhists in less wealthy areas to come and to inhabit those places. So this is part of the ethnic cleansing, part of the genocide, and it's this bureaucracy, this law that exists. And there's so many other examples. I just chose that one. But it's also used in the immigration detention system, very, very obviously. For example, you describe the process of officially applying for refugee status. When you're on Manus Island in this prison, this detention center, you obviously want to apply to be a refugee. This is why you've come here. But you wrote that after going through all the proper legal channels, I only ran into brick walls. It was so frustrating to read this in the book too when I was reading it, because everything you did was it just was a brick wall, like you say. You wrote, the system was designed not to work. It was only to punish and demoralize. So can you really describe those parallels between how bureaucracy is used to oppress, and maybe some other examples from your experience, and how kind of bureaucracy is just, paperwork and forms to fill out, and having a process for certain things really erases the humanity of people and of the situation that people like you were going through.
I think I could spend hours, like how meticulously. I often describe it as a work of evil genius, like the way it was made. It just just mind-boggling how, for example, one specific example inside the prison, while the detention regime knew we were using single wallpaper, toilet paper, or double wall, we have to put a written request in English for a Q-tip. That request, written request, go through the welfare and the immigrations has to approve, and that take weeks. And that approval go to the warehouse, hand out the Q-tips to the welfare worker, and the welfare worker have to deliver it, and you have to sign. That is only if you were able to read and write in English. If not, then you write your own language in your own native language, and it was sent back to Australia from about 600 kilometers away, and then got translated and sent back to the island, was then go through the process of welfare to immigrations, somebody approving behind the scenes, then welfare getting Q-tips, and went back. And I wrote a lot about I had braces when I was inside the prisons, and I couldn't get a toothbrush for a couple of months, for a couple of weeks, and I couldn't get a pillow for a couple of months. And this was how meticulously designed. And oftentimes, it was so subtly designed with just a flavor of bureaucracy that you don't think they don't have any intention to do this. But the way it was layered through process was bureaucracy at work, I think, in a beautiful way. And the same thing happened. It was the smallest as Q-tip, all the way up to I was the only person inside the whole detention populations who went all the way up to Papua New Guinea Supreme Court to appeal that the decisions that I was handed, a refugee decision that I was not a refugee, without ever meeting me or talking to me, and getting my name wrong, my date of birth wrong, and a few other key details wrong. And at first I was you gotta be kidding. Then when I had a habit of enjoying fine prints and just also out of boredom in detention where you got nothing to read, you just scavenge on everything you could. So I asked for the, I think it is called decision rationale, and why I was given a non-refugee status in the first place, despite fleeing all these atrocities in Burma and genocide. And I asked for the rationale. When the rationale was delivered, they got everything wrong, from my name, from my date of birth, to from my other key details. And I went through appealing at the first to the detention regime, the lawyer who went through the UNHCRs and the local court, and all the way up to country Supreme Courts, saying there is judicial error, there is administrative errors here. You haven't met me, you haven't talked to me. Yet that decision was never corrected. And I would get hit by brick walls in every step of the way. Yet I was the only person who was able, I think, at that point, to go through all the way up to Supreme Court and pointed out there is a huge flaw in this whole detention regime thing. But it was layered with bureaucracy. And for someone who didn't even have access to phone, lodging an application to Supreme Court is extremely difficult. And if you were to layer it with all the other necessary legal hurdles and bureaucracy in place, we were not able to communicate freely. All of our mails and telephones were tapped, and it goes through the detention regime, and sometimes intervene in the middle. I think whatever the intention was when the bureaucracy were created, whether it is efficiency, chain of commands, or whatever, it's definitely has not worked out, and then it is working against the very peoples, I think, who were supposed to receive help like from these procedures and bureaucracy. It was in turn turned into oppression tools every step of the way. That is my experience.
Yeah, and gosh, yeah, you're the example, the literal and metaphorical example of the Q-tip, from the Q-tip all the way up to kind of trying to submit your case to the Supreme Court and challenge the decision. I think the layers and layers and layers of bureaucracy were so apparent. Even when you arrived in Canada, there's these bureaucratic policies as well that can impact and further oppress. And this really is a kind of a nice segue to our next question that Anna and I were really interested in asking about is, and you have this sentence where you say, human beings are made of paper. Birth certificates, passports, driver's licenses, identity cards, tax records, marriage certificates, and university degrees. Even your refugee claim when you arrived in Canada had to be in writing, right? You had to write it out. And actually, when you wrote that out and you had the actual script in the book, it made me tear up a lot. It was quite powerful, despite it being very brief. But you have to write out your refugee claim to enter Canada as well. So you continue in the book, you say it's only when you're wiped from the system or your pieces of paper are scattered across the sea, as happened when you lost all of your belongings at sea, that you realize how much of this stuff means to you. Without paper, in the eyes of society, you don't exist. So you traveled through 7 countries and 3 continents without papers, without any kind of papers that actually were legal and replicated your own status as a human. So in a way, you didn't exist without those papers, according to the system that you're operating in. Can you describe this experience of not technically existing? Because in Burma as well, you are, according to the government there, you don't exist as well, right? And then you don't exist during this search for sanctuary. So maybe if you could talk a little bit about that. I know Anna and I were really interested in hearing your thoughts.
I didn't see the paperwork and the numbering of people as a tool. I thought back in Burma, I used to think it was just inefficiency or just plain stupidity of like inefficiency of the way the military are working, who were probably better with a number-minded head than to call people by name is to give families. So in Burma, all the family were assigned a number, and that's how you were represented, and that's being replicated in when I arrived to Australia. Actually, I think I have a paragraph somewhere. Oh, okay. So this was the very first moment I first arrived on the Australian shore. The first formality was a strip search carried out by latex-gloved officer from Australia's Department of Immigration and Citizenship. We were saddest group of visitor imaginable, thin, sweaty, exhausted, dressed in sea-soaked beach clothes. Next, someone fastened a green plastic band around my left wrist. On it was written EML 019 in black permanent marker. I assume it was a clerical tag used to keep track of each new arrival. The official took everything we had, our papers, medications, and placed it in bags, each with identifying number. The Australian didn't ask for our names or where we were from, or bother with any small talks. And that EML 019 remained my de facto name for the next 4.5 years on the island. And this was just, again, textbook examples of like a one-on-one of how to strip individuality of any human being and assign a number. we tend to think such thing would not happen in this age, or at least in normal world. But what I experienced when I went out of the prison, I escaped the prison as a stateless person without any ID or any passport, I realized the pain of not existing on paper, and in the eyes of the society, you just don't matter. And this is where my refugee claim need to be written. Was what I learned was who you are, whatever you say, what you experience doesn't matter, but whatever is written down on a paper, verified by some sort of authority or accepted by the authority, is what matter in the eyes of society. And even in my experience, to be admissible to court, your claims need to be written and verified by paper. So in every steps of the way, the papers being exist on the papers is actually not was. I think today this is still the same for many, is as much as you are alive or dead. If you're not on paper, you're just simply dead. Like you can't do anything and you can't go anywhere. And for people who would never go to detention, this is something I think we take it for granted. I remember at one point I was struggling to explain to someone why I couldn't get a passport. So can you just go get a passport and get a visa? Like, it's like many things that people take granted for is not the same if you don't exist on paper. So I think, especially for those who are fleeing countries who often don't have the luxury of planning their trips and getting a visa and getting their passport ready and in order, who just leave at the whim of the fire or the version is. It just, I find word hard to find words like how to describe it, because it just, you cease to exist and everything's start working against your favor, in your favors once you are not on paper. And I've been through that, not just one time, not just two times, but multiple times across all these countries. And even when I arrived here, I couldn't do anything until I was restored back on paper by a judge at the refugee board. You are a refugee and with protections. That until that point, I don't know how to I couldn't find. I'm scratching my head here, but I couldn't find anything to compare it to, because there is no alternative. You just simply cease to exist if you're not on paper. That's how big of a thing that's.
Yeah, Jaivet, when I was reading those passages, it really brought me back to some of what I hear from Vietnamese refugees who came here in the 70s and 80s. They keep on talking about this yellow paper. And this was when I was a social worker, I was early in, and they call it the yay yang. And it's like, my yellow paper, my yellow paper. I'm like, what is your yellow paper? It's the immigration document that I guess recognizes them. And it really made me think of what you were writing in this book is really like the signifier. The papers themselves not only represent the signified, the person, the human, but even within, this book is a critique of colonialism really too. And so within the colonial order and the politics of recognition, the papers actually stand in for the humans, and in some ways are even more valuable than the humans themselves in our colonial order, right? And you write about this theme of like a ghost-like existence, right? That's carried throughout the book. You wrote about the Rohingya as they were ghosts hiding in plain sight, and their mantra was, "Don't mess with the government, and you'll be fine." And then on Christmas Island, you wrote about how the people there protected the crabs, right? These like monstrous things that you described. and where killing one carried a penalty of 5,000 in fines. So you said it seemed both sad and strange that the same islanders who passed laws to protect these crawling eyesores recoiled at the presence of human migrants. And when I read that passage, I was really brought back to, what was said about the Vietnamese refugees, right? There was an American general, William Westmoreland, in the 1970s, who said that, and this person was the commander of the United States forces during the war in Vietnam for a period of time. And he said, the Oriental doesn't put the same price on life as does a Westerner. So life is plentiful. Life is cheap in the Orient. Life is disposable, right? It's almost like colonized humans are ghosts until we are recognized by the colonizers. We're assumed to not have value. We are assumed to not put value upon ourselves. And I think it's to justify the subhuman and inhumane actions that are taken against us. And what I love about this book, and right, I love that throughout this whole book, you show that there is this innate, right, through your families and your supporters, there's an innate belief in the human value. And you describe it, I think, for your mom or for your parents as a DNA level, like a will for value, for recognition, for a better life. And it was so moving, I think. And it just really brought me back to I think your stories in your book, it transverses, it cuts across time and countries, and it allows so many points for connection for many of us. So I really appreciate that.
I think some of the things, it just not traverse time, but some of the things just never change. So for example, it's like the signified and signifiers in terms of the power dynamic. I came this to realize, like, it was not just controlling, but it was also changing the narrative as the colonizers or at the power wish. For example, during my time inside the prisons and on the island, we were being our label were shifted to, from at first it was irregular arrival to illegal aliens to detainees to transferees to processees to deportees. Like it was kind of this grip to keep the narratives on the power side, and then and shifted at the whim of the colonizers or the prisoners in my case. And I think that was the way it worked in the colonial time, and then that's how it worked today. So some things just, I guess, never change.
Yeah. It's like the states employ the best and brightest marketing professionals, right? Yeah. Mm-hmm.
I wanted to add one other thing that I thought was at the end of the story. You say in the book that the Canadian judge who granted you refugee status, you were very grateful for. You said he or she, I can't remember, restored your existence on paper. And I was thinking as you wrote that, I thought, actually, you know what? Even more than that, I know that legally, yes, of course, but this book actually, to me, feels like a manifesto of your existence, right? This is to document that you were here, that you went through this experience, much more than a passport can, or a passport tells part of the story, right? Maybe with the stamps, the places you visited, but this book is such a thorough testament to your existence. And really, I think such an important contribution in that regard. So I just wanted to add that into the conversation. I want to move into another theme here. And again, if anybody has questions, please feel free to add them to the Q&A. I'll try to respond to one that's coming in right now. But what was so interesting about the book too is the corporatocracy that you mentioned, and the money. Oh my gosh, the money flowing into these systems was incredible. And I've heard these statistics before, but to put them in the context of your story, I think was quite powerful. So the money flowing through these operations is really staggering. So you give one example of many, how there's one firm that was awarded a $423 million contract over 22 months to house refugees in another immigration detention center. It wasn't the Manus Island one, but it was a different one on the same island, I believe. And you wrote that this amounted to around, and this is mind-blowing, $1,600 per day to house each detainee. So you're saying that they're getting $1,600 a day to house each detainee. So that's more than the daily rate for a 5-star hotel room overlooking Sydney Harbor. If, as one analyst found, the real cost of housing a detainee was actually $108 per day, so this is what the real cost was, that means that this company, Paladin, was earning $17 million per month in pure profit. $17 million in pure profit. And it is examples such as these that makes you label Australia as a corporatocracy, and I'd agree with that assessment completely. You wrote, I lost authority over my own life. That claim had been assumed by the Australian government and sold to corporations who destroyed us to reward stakeholders. So can you speak a little bit more to the role of capitalism and corporations running the detention system in Australia, but also in other places as well that you're familiar with? One other example I thought of as I was reading this was the cigarettes, right? They let the cigarette companies had a monopoly within the prisons. That was one thing that they were kind of pushing, right? So this is very interesting dynamics in terms of the corporatocracy.
It was to highlight how hand in hand the power and money goes, and all this, how these corporations were really playing the game and pulling all the string from behind the scene. Meanwhile, general public tend to think, it's a democracy. It's been passed through parliaments and fairly debated. But I wanted to point out everything that's being passed through the parliament. Everything legal is not right. I often bring this up whenever there is questions of, I often get this critique. I have to justify this critique of, it's a democratic society. It's run by elected officials, but not to that extreme. But so was the law banning women from voting was passed through the parliament. So was back in the time Jim Crow was passed through the Jim Crow law was passed through the parliament. So everything that's being passed through the parliament doesn't mean it is right. Doesn't mean it is morally right. And oftentimes, if we go through, this is where I was struggling back in the detention. I wasn't very in terms of politics and in terms of policy. I wasn't very well read at that point. So I was struggling to pick up narratives and to pick up the real deals with this, among this, all the rhetoric. So I wanted, but I am good a little bit with number, better than words. And then so I went a level deeper, okay, where this past budgets were really going, and then how this works, because oftentimes numbers don't lie, or at least they're harder to deceive. So I went through and it's all money going to these corporations. Oftentimes, even the government process is we tend to think there's fair process, there's tender, but it's not tender when you only invite one corporation and that's the winner. And that's how it was functioning. Majority of I have seen prison expanding in front of my eyes from 1 prison to 4 prison. And I compared this to building your own coffin in front of your eyes. And it will be hard to deny those who are not motivated by the corporation involved, by the people who have to make money from. So in part, people's lives in detention were determined by how much money they are to make, and how much corporations were able to. And this is not just Australia. Yeah, I was in Ottawa yesterday, and I was hearing some of the conversation about how visa processing by RCC is being outsourced to an Indian company. So it's not. I think it's if you pay enough attention and go deeper than the typical rhetoric, you will always find this parallel of it is oftentimes corporations and money that is controlling and that's determining people's lives in both in detentions, or in yesterday's case it was out of detention. So it has always been corporations and money who have to gain from it, pulling the string.
Did you have any follow-up on that, or?
No, I think the Jaivet, your observation of the capitalism behind this whole enterprise was consistent throughout the book, and you wrote something that I highlighted, but I didn't quite understand until later on. You wrote halfway in the book, you wrote, "A dead prisoner is no news to anyone," and I'm guilty of marking up a book, so I wrote next to it. I said, why would they want them to live, right? But then later on, as you're weaving the story, and you're such a wonderful storyteller, and the writing is just is very I don't know, it just grips at you, right? Like this isn't the type of like content. Like I was like, oh no, is this going to be like scary? And am I going to have like flashbacks myself, right? But yeah, the way you write is just so gripping and so engaging. But it's not till later when you talked about, at one point, New Zealand offered a deal to resettle the refugee people, right? And that deal was turned down. So then I thought, I imagine that, refugee people are these little moving pieces. Their currency, the exchange as currency, as monetary currency, right? Their currency for the prison industrial complex, where all of these massive, like billion dollar deals get made behind doors. But they're also currency for the political agendas as presented as political problems to be solved, right? So if you can talk about this, if as a politician, as the politicians, you talked about the Australian prime ministers and immigration politicians can present that they are so-called solving this problem, then that is actually traded in for votes and for public, elections and stuff like that. So yeah, that's just something that I really appreciate about this book.
Yeah, dead prisoners, I think we were only there oftentimes in a system where that was designed to make the most out of misery, and it was just not because they were making money as long as we were alive. It was the level of the torture was like calibrated, so fine-tuned so nicely that it was just a tad below the breaking point. So we had like a lot of a huge suicide rate inside the prison, and to the point where the guards have to carry knives to cut down the nose of people hanging. So it was in many ways it's the work of pure evil genius. Like it was so fine-tuned, so meticulous work, design. It just boggled my mind how. At first I thought, no, this can be real. But then later on, I started to realize this was designed that actually there was some big document from the government's offices where the detention was designed to break people down, and but oftentimes in the directions of where there are money to make. And in comparison to Australia case, and I think this hasn't been the case in Canada, but I see from time to time something along the line of people talking or media narrative along the line of that way, where refugees or inclusions of refugees like costing money, and then like we often see the money being spent on inclusions and trainings of these individuals, these refugees. I don't call them as like a money is spent on training. I often call them like money is spent on enabling. Like a lot of these individuals arrive with huge potentials of their own. You just have to enable it, and then like enjoy the human capitals that are like filtered through 3 layers, and then like you got the best out of it without any work, and just enjoy it by enabling them. And we often tend to see it as a money being spent, and then if we lock it up, we don't have, the taxpayer don't have to spend. But I think the case that I illustrated in the book, and the case of Australia, was actually costing much more money. It's more costlier to exclude people than to include them. So and then what at a great cost to both those who are suffering inside, and also a stain in the morale of the nation. So Ivan, what I wanted to point out is like not not inclusion that costing money, but there's a study, I can't remember the figures, but there was about 3.1 time return of every money that goes into enabling these individuals, and then like get the return of 3.1 times instead of excluding, which is a money going to corporates and at a great cost to the taxpayers, suffering to those who are being detained, and the moral stains of the nations, like the case in Australia.
Yeah, I can't keep, it's hard. Every time I think about it, I'm like $1,600 a day for one person. It just seems insane. You talk about, I'm going to try to combine two questions here, because you talk about how hopeless it was, and kind of the lowest moments you wrote, experiencing what you call the slow death of refugee limbo, which I thought was a brilliant phrase and a really very accurate way to describe it. You wrote, "There's no glint of hope in the darkness. To wake up in the morning was a sign, what was to sign up for another day of anguish." And so, as you mentioned, you know, there was high rates of suicide on Manus Island and in the prison there. At the same time as I'm reading these horrible things, you really were able to permeate the story with humor and sarcasm, which is maybe, I mean, gosh, it's such a hard story to read. I guess at any point I could have just turned it, put it down and not finished it. But the humor and the sarcasm and your kind of voice throughout the process really stuck with me. You wrote that jokes were a typical way of letting off steam. They got passed around like a common currency, bringing us together. One example that made me laugh was you were caught with a broken phone. It like totally didn't work. And apparently phones were contraband at the time. The guard told you that having this phone is putting everyone's life in danger. And you wrote that you imagine my waterlogged inactive device attacking me in my sleep or chasing my fellow prisoners around the yard. So I love that kind of cartoonish image of kind of to draw how kind of insanely humorous some of the policies are on Manus Island. And in another instance, you and the other detainees refer to one of the architects of the Australian immigration system as Mr. Potato Head. It's kind of your way to let off steam and show, just disrespect somebody who's wholly disrespecting you and kind of throwing your life away. So I wanted to talk a bit more about humor and how it played a role in your survival, in both your present challenges you faced and when you were also retelling your story. And I'll just one other note that I found. I was looking at your Twitter feed and you wrote that I guess Toronto Public Library had categorized your book under humor. Was that real? In addition to, I think they also said fiction, but they said biography and humor, which I thought was really funny, and you found that funny as well. So the humor kind of keeps going, right? So
I'm not exactly knowledgeable, so I'm not exactly sure what is the technique behind or the mechanism behind this jokes, humor, oftentimes very dark jokes, I should say, in this pressure cooker, for some of us, like it was people would joke more, like people who go to try to end their life just before ending it. And I'm assuming there are other mechanisms in literature like that's being looked into deep into why humor dark jokes come like as a way of letting off the steam of this pressure cooker the way at this point. I'm not exactly sure the mechanism behind. I only experience it, so I can only talk from the person who experienced it. But it was probably the only way to light things up when there is nothing to cheer you up in the hellhole where there is really nothing to look forward to. And we had made jokes out of like pretty much everything. We wouldn't say, don't say good morning, just say morning because there's nothing good in it. Like from those kind of casual joke to like really, really dark, sarcastic jokes keep coming up in the detentions as the only way. I'm not sure if it is even survival mechanisms, like when people come to such a sense of pressures and there is nothing else to let go of humor. But it was a huge part of the whole detention system, which I kind of pick it up and still enjoy it. But yeah, I would be interested to read in the future, like what is it really that kind of fuels humor at this very depressing state, and this huge pressure, and yet humor were there, dark jokes, casual joking, casual humor were there. So I myself wonder. I only wrote it because I experienced it, and that's what it was. But I would personally be interested to see what is the mechanism behind.
And you talk about the meaning of Viktor Frankl's work, Man's Search for Meaning, and I found that to be such a beautiful story of how your caseworker had actually discreetly left you. This was after your own suicide attempt and trying to find hope in what you felt was quite a hopeless situation. Left an electronic version of Man's Search for Meaning by Viktor Frankl, who's a Holocaust survivor, who wrote about how he dealt with being in a Holocaust camp. And you were able to print out 5 pages of the book every 2 weeks, and you bound it, you sewed it up and bound it into an actual hard copy book, and it was really important to you. So I was just thinking, Viktor Frankl actually talks about humor. It's the only thing you can control is your own reaction to what's happening, your own mind, your own experience of what's going on. You can't control all this bureaucracy and the corporatocracy and things like that. So that kind of reminded me of Viktor Frankl's work, of the humor there as well. So
yeah, Victor book was quite helpful. I think I just got it just at the right time that I needed something. It was at this point of where I see nothing meaningful, and the detention itself was indefinite. So we didn't have a sentence or date that we can look forward to and then say, oh, I have this many days left and I have this much left, then I'll be a free man. But it wasn't the case. The detention was indefinite. So we really have nothing to look forward to. There is no light at the end of the tunnel. Just waking up another day was like preparing yourself to go through the same torture. So Victor came in just at that point with the perspective of how to find meaning, like when you don't see far enough. It is the analogy he used was, I believe, that if you see the movie at a one frame at a point, you don't see any meaning. You actually have to watch consecutively all the frames to be able to make sense of the whole movie, and you are only able to make it if you watch it until the end. So I said maybe this was just one frame of my life, and it makes sense that I don't see any meaning. It makes sense that it was just pure suffering. So it's kind of motivations behind to leave, like why I should leave until the end. Otherwise, I won't get to see or make sense of the whole movie at all. So I think Victor book was just the right book at the right time in the right place that I needed.
Yeah. Yeah, absolutely. I just want to open it up. If there's any questions from the audience, please type it in the Q&A. We're monitoring that for questions. Otherwise, Ann and I can monopolize the whole conversation. We have plenty of questions. I'll wait for if there's any questions from the audience, and maybe I can ask one question in the meantime. So technology, I found, was really striking. Another theme in your story was technology. So cell phones were lifelines to your family and friends. You were able to secure a contraband cell phone, and that, after that, a lot of the other men in detention got their own as well. And you were able to look up up-to-date information on news and current events, and you were able to use your cell phone to look up immigration policies or book flights for countries that when you were trying to escape and try to get to Canada. And also you meticulously decided your next step to seek safety, which I found would be impossible otherwise without the technology. You also currently you're currently working for a startup that brings tech solutions to humanitarian crises. So I find this theme of technology to be this thread throughout your story. And can you really talk about that role of technology, and also in refugee displacement more broadly?
I find it's equally important. I think if we were to compare back with the early days of 1900s or even late 1800s, if you were not able to read like literate, and you're as useless of like anybody. And if you are not technically literate in technology, it's as much of a hassle like back in the day if you were not able to read. And oftentimes a lot of the systems were designed in early days and didn't necessarily include the tech component of it, even though it's becoming much better now. If you look into the border tech around the world, border surveillance is like a state of the art tech work. So I found it impossible to beat or to navigate through the system if I wasn't as equally informed in the technology as well. And part of the reason of my earlier work regarding in the startup of like in the startup of 8, actually technology of 8, was I found it pretty much the rest of the world, all the corporate have used the advantage and the advances in technology, and that the humanitarian sectors are the only sectors left behind to actually use the advances in technologies and benefit from it. And that's why we have today sending winter coat to earthquake survivors of Hawaii and high heel to people in the refugee camps living in Zimbabwe. So I found it like a really hard that the rest of the, I like to call it like good sectors of the humanity didn't catch up on the tech, but like while all the border surveillance, border tech, and all the corporates like harvesting data and making use of it. So I found it like important at this age to be, somehow informed enough in the rising technology to be able to navigate through the system. In my point, it was more of a beating system that I was handed, that was stacked against me.
Yeah, and that theme came out throughout the book. Technology and even like being able to top up SIM cards and access Wi-Fi. Like that's for me anyways. I'm not a techie person, so for me that's like it's really impressive. And so I guess I know we're coming up to time, but maybe we can squeeze in maybe 1 or 2 last questions. I'm wondering, as you're talking about how technology kind of helped you to move through and eventually to escape. Can you talk a little bit about your network of, you call them your league of helpers, your network of friends who support you to move through? And I'm thinking about that because in terms of, let's say in terms of advocacy and support of, for refugee peoples, right? What are some of your central messaging that you want to give to refugee advocacy and advocates, many of whom might need to strengthen their own courage of conviction, like the courage that was really shown through your writing, right? As you wrote about your own helpers on Manus, such as Tessa, Winiaka, and Nina, amongst many others.
Doesn't matter how much I was informed in technology, and it just really just didn't matter. At the end of the day, it was this little secret network of helpers that enabled me. The reason that I'm talking to you here, otherwise, like without them, I don't think I would have ever made it out alive. Two main message that I wanted to get through in terms of helping, in terms of refugee advocacy. One message is like, the same way I received help from these peoples, oftentimes refugees were not in a position, or not. This could be in many ways, but sometimes, for example, for me, I wasn't able to disclose my full story due to various reasons, security, both for me and for them. At other point, it could be language barrier. At other point, it could be mental traumas that they don't want to revisit. So oftentimes, it's refugee cannot disclose their full story to somebody else, even to someone who they need help from. And then how do you expect someone to help you if you're not telling them the whole story? And this has various there are other various things I can go on and go on, but from language barrier to security to traumas to all in all. And my message is, if these people were not to help me out without telling them the whole story, I would have never make it. And my message is sometimes there are other reasons that refugees and people seeking help cannot tell the whole story, but yet they deserve the full help. And we often help people that we know, but sometimes in my case, it was I received help from complete strangers. And sometimes I encourage anybody, sometimes take a chance on a stranger and help them. And you will, and help them within a way without without any expectations. Just help them. And what happened without helping without expectations is like you never know what will happen. But what actually happened is it has a ripple effect. For example, people who helped me at that time, there's no way they could know that they're setting a person free. It was just a kind gesture from a stranger to another stranger. For example, the person, the nurse who was working at the prison, and then like when I was lining up to get on the board, to get on the plane from the prison, she recognized me, and then like she knew I was a prisoner and escaping. Yet she simply just looked away and as if nothing happened. If it wasn't her simple gesture of kindness, looking away and not recognizing, she would have no idea that she is setting up a person free. But in reality, she was setting a person free. And then like those kind of small gestures to complete a stranger. I know that we don't hesitate to help people we know, our friends or family, but sometimes it is worth to help to people that you don't know, and then you will never know what will happen. And then sometimes that help, like the slightest gesture, is actually the breaking point in somebody's life journey, is the last drop that will break the weight. And you never know if your small gesture is that last tiny drop that the stranger needed. In my case, it was many times without those people who had no idea what they're helping with, was the very last thing I needed to rescue me. They needed the very last drop I needed to escape, the very last gesture I was able to get on the plane, and so on and so forth. So my message is sometimes refugees and other people seeking help might not be in a position to share you the whole thing, but yet please take a chance to help them without knowing the full story. And especially for those who are in refugee advocate circles and other people working with refugees or for refugees. This is where I often think, like, sometimes we feel so overwhelmed, like this is such a huge system, this is such a big thing. Just my individual action alone will not make a dent, will not make any difference. But if you're someone who is feeling like that, this is exactly where you take on to beat the system. Like you help another strangers, and then that has a ripple effect. And then together we're making a dent in the system that is otherwise unbeatable. And that's the only way until today I have found of making any changes. If you think you're overwhelmed of like this whole system stack up against you, one small kind of actions at a time will have this ripple effect of setting up maybe other families like me, like I was being set up free by these individuals, small actions. And then it will have a ripple effect of like they become advocate themselves, or they became they started working on the systems. And if you were like, we have hundreds of people, and eventually, who knows, we might be able to change it. That's the message I wanted to pass through.
It's a wonderful message to end on, Jaivet. I think like that how important the small things are in terms of helping others, and small ripple effects can have major repercussions. I mean, even like I said, writing this book can have waves in terms of making policy changes. I'll just say I'll end by just saying how important stories are in making change, making people aware of the situation of what people are going through. So thank you so much for sharing this story. I don't know if you had a few words just to end on, or Okay.
I think this is it was beautifully said, and I just want to, I see there's actually some social students in the audience too, so I think this is exactly what they needed to hear, Jaivet. So thank you.
Thank you so much. Thank you, An, for being here and helping moderate and to ask the questions and contributing to a great discussion. Thank you, Jaivet, for your contribution. I feel like we have 30 more questions to ask on our Google Doc, but we'll have to maybe do a part 2 or something like that in the future, or maybe just grab a coffee and chat. But thank you so much for being here. Thank you everyone for listening. It was a great experience for everybody. I hope you enjoyed it as well. Thanks.
Thanks, everyone. Bye.
Bye.